Right. Welcome to the How to Apply webinar for Spring 2023 rental applications to the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program. Just a brief overview of what we will touch on today. We will talk through what is ASNH, what's new and what's the same in our applications. This is going to be identical to the fall 2022 application for the competitive cycle. We'll talk through what that application submission process looks like, the scoring overview, the notification process, and then we'll do some Q&As. In that notification process, there will be a slide that says application announcements come from the Office of the Governor. That is also true of this situation that we're in right now. As many of you know, the fall awards have not yet been announced. I can share that all of those applications are under review, and we are anticipating that our team will be able to be in touch with the project primary contact listed in CAMS within 1 to 2 days after that governor's announcement. Again, we are holding our How to Apply a bit earlier than typical, and that is because we are doing that system switchover at the end of this week at DHCD. So just level setting at the very beginning. I can't answer any questions that are asked about the fall 2022 application. My team is ready to be in contact with everyone within 1 to 2 days after that announcement. So what is ASNH? This program is affordable and special needs housing. It is funding construction or renovation of affordable housing. For the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to touch just on the rental side. Our program does also approve projects that are single-family homes. That How to Apply will be held later in the week. This is a single competitive application form that awards 5 different sources of federal and state funding. There are 2 application cycles each year, in the fall and in the spring. We follow this Virginia state fiscal year, which is similar to a school year calendar. Our spring deadline will be Tuesday, April 4th. That is about 32 days, 33 days after the application opens on Friday, March the 3rd. We will touch on this again, but for anyone who is unfamiliar, the CAMS system that DHCD uses for applications automatically closes at midnight. So we will be available through the business day on the 4th, but you have until 11:59 to submit your application. For fiscal year 2023, so again, similar to what we had in the fall round, there are some changes to the application structure. So we have reduced the total number of narrative questions. We have reduced the total number of application attachments. The primary change there is that many of the previous attachments were condensed into a single Excel workbook. The application instructions were reorganized and we updated the language in the format of those, and the same true for the program guidelines. We should have updated program guidelines for this spring round, including the closing date and these 2 recordings from the rental side and homeowner side, uploaded to the DHCD website by next week on Tuesday. The things that are, all right, Tracy says, why is my presentation small? Is there, what I see is the PowerPoint taking up the full screen. Is that what other folks are seeing as well? And Tracy, we will, great. Yes. So Tracy, this may be a setting on your computer. If you go to the bottom of the screen and click on more options, it's the 3 dots, then you should be able to go to full screen or change layout to make that adjustment. I can say that the recording will be posted and should be available showing the full screen. And I know the state template is also small text, which doesn't help when you go out of full screen. The items that are the same on the application, most of the actual requirements of the program have been retained. So what constitutes an eligible project or an eligible applicant entity, the funding sources, the limits of those funding sources, submission online through CAMS, our announcement process, all of these things are remaining the same. The only changes are really in the structure of applying itself. There we go. So applicant eligibility. The first step in applying for ASNH funding is determining whether your organization is an eligible applicant for the project. So that could be nonprofit or for-profit housing developers, public housing authorities, DHCD certified community development housing organizations. All of these entities can take on a development project that is eligible for application to funding. If you have any questions about whether your organization is an eligible applicant, there are further instructions in the program guidelines and sort of definitions of each of these terms. And my team can also, our contact information is in the program guidelines, and my team is happy to answer any questions about determining eligibility. Once you've determined what the applicant organization is, that organization has to take on a role in the development that is eligible as well. So that could be the owner of the site of development. It could be not the owner, but the contractual developer of the site or building. It could be the sponsor of the project, which is a particular setup typically utilized by community housing development organizations, where the applicant is an owner or a partial owner, agreeing to convey ownership to a second nonprofit at either project completion or another predetermined milestone. If you believe that your eligible applicant role is not owner or developer, but is sponsor, then we ask that you please contact our team, and we can make sure that we have the appropriate documentation to show that you are the project sponsor and also that the project is eligible. The main piece here is that it cannot be the project LLC. So the development organization cannot be the owning entity of the project. So the owner that currently holds valid title to the site, but not the LIHTC entity that will be owning the development. And we are happy to answer questions about that as well. There are some further requirements for applicant eligibility. What we require is that this applicant is the primary partner in the project, responsible for long-term operations or compliance of the rental units, free of outstanding audit issues. And I would recommend, particularly for smaller organizations, reviewing the DHCD audit or financial documentation policy to ensure that you are set up to be in compliance. It does not necessarily mean, depending on the size of your organization, that you have to do a full audit annually. All of those requirements are linked in our program guidelines and application instructions and are available on the DHCD website as well. So again, same, consistent across the years, project eligibility. They can be rental or home buyer projects. We'll touch only on the rental aspects here today. The minimum number of units that constitutes a quote project for the purposes of applying for funding is 5 doors. So we have had in the past scattered site, smaller developments, maybe 10 units or so, come in for application. This could also be a large LIHTC twin deal where both the 9% and 4% side are over 100 units and are applying. So whatever constitutes the number of units in your project. As long as it's over 5, it's a qualifying project. We allow projects to apply for funding, whether they are new construction, substantial renovations of existing housing, or an adaptive reuse building. We do require common ownership, management, and financing. And really the place where we see this affecting developments the most is that 9% and 4% twin deals have to apply independently of each other. So the 9% deal would have one application that comes in, and the 4% deal would have a second application that comes in because they are separate financial entities. There is a minimum investment of $15,000 per unit, 3 or more major systems. So that sort of gives you an idea of the scope. When we talk about substantial renovations, we are really looking at not a lipstick reno, paint and tile work, that sort of thing, but we're looking for an investment of DHCD funding that will allow the project to hit an easy 15 years without needing another set of DHCD investment. So similar to if you were going to renovate a LIHTC project at year 16, that's sort of the level of renovation that we are looking to see. Again, scattered sites and SROs are allowable in terms of projects. We strongly recommend that if you have an SRO project, a scattered site rental project, that you have a technical assistance conversation with a member of the ASNH team. That really allows us to talk through the project and then answer any questions that we have ahead of the application being put in. DHCD does not have an opportunity to cure after applications are submitted. It's really like a point in time. Starting April the 4th, we're going to evaluate applications as they are submitted. So if you are reading through the program guidelines and you think, probably we're pretty close to being eligible, we recommend that you just contact our team so that we can talk through any questions that we might have, and you can answer them in that narrative portion or by adjusting the attachments that you give us. So for FY23, these are the funding sources that are available through June of 2023. So our full fiscal year, we have about $8 million of home investment partnerships, federal money. We have about $13 million of National Housing Trust Fund, about $60 million of Virginia Housing Trust Fund. We'll touch on the PSH fund a bit later. And then we have about $80 million of housing innovations and energy efficiency funding. This covers our full fiscal year and is independent of any budgetary changes that are happening right now in the General Assembly. So Virginia Housing Trust Fund is one that every year the funding might go up, it might go down. These are definite amounts of money that are available to us through the end of the fiscal year. Housing innovations and energy efficiency is proceeds from the RGGI fund. And this, again, independent of what may occur in the General Assembly or with the Air Board, these are funds that are allocated to the ASNH program through the end of the fiscal year, which encompasses this spring application. So project funding limits are going to be the same. Lillian, if you would like to put your question in the chat, you may do that. And if it's possible for me to answer it now, I will. Otherwise, we'll hold it until the end of the presentation. The project funding limits, these are going to be the same from the fall. It is possible, and some of us have had conversations with each other about changing this for the spring or for the fall next year. But for this year, the project funding limit is, roughly speaking, $700,000 per source. That is across each of the competitive funds that we run. So Home and National Housing Trust Fund are federal components of the program, or Virginia Housing Trust Fund, which means that across all three, you can have a total of $2.1 million For projects that provide qualified PSH units, we allow an increase to that funding. So up to $900,000 per source, $2.4 million maximum across all sources. Those project funding limits are independent of the high E awards. So once a project has a competitive score and receives an allocation, even within the same round, those projects are eligible for housing innovations and energy efficiency if they request them and meet the requirements. So for housing innovations and energy efficiency, and we'll touch on this in a few slides, there are additional requirements for energy performance in the building. You are eligible for up to 10% of total development costs or $2 million, whichever is the lower amount, which means that your award could be as high as $4.4 million as a maximum award from DHCD. Tracy asked, can we request funds in the spring round and then again in the fall round? The answer to that is yes. However, if you have a project that is prepared to request funds in the spring and you receive an award, or rather prior to applying for the spring, I would ask that you have a conversation with us because we do have to score each application as it comes in. So if it is possible for us to condense the ask down, these project funding limits run across years. So you can't apply in the spring and then get another $700,000 in the fall. Your cap for the project remains the same. So if it is possible for us to help you condense your application request into a single round, we would love to provide that assistance because it gives you a more predictable stream of funding and it gives us slightly less work because we have to independently read and score all of these applications. Jen asks if projects have been awarded like a competitive source and they apply for additional high E in this round. Yes. So high E, once a project has secured either in a previous round or in a concurrent round, if a project has secured a competitive source, which is Home, National Housing Trust Fund, or Virginia Housing Trust Fund, then to the extent that we have funding available and the project has a gap, we can award additional high E. So if your total development costs are $30 million and you have an award of $500,000 of high E and you would like to reapply for another $1.5 million of high E, you can do that. If a project would reapply, I would say just shoot an email to myself or your program administrator and we can talk through what that timing looks like. Erica asked if high E has to be paired. Yes, we do not award high E independently of the competitive application. So the requirements for income targeting remain the same. These are programmatic requirements, and we will touch on the rest of the questions coming in the chat towards the end. For each of our state sources, we require units to be serving 80% AMI or below. For those state funding sources, especially if you have a mixed income building or a building with market rate units, we have an option for you to call that out in the application. So we do not require that the full building serve only 80% AMI or below. We would just ask that you sort of detail the unit mix, both in the narrative section of the application, and then fill out the underwriting information appropriately to reflect the market rate or unrestricted units. For home investment partnerships, this is a federal program. Generally speaking, we are looking for units at 60% or below. There is a requirement for 20% of those units to be 50% or below, but this actual underwriting, predicting the unit mix or choosing the unit mix rather, is something that your program administrator will work with you on. The National Housing Trust Fund is a requirement to serve units at 30% AMI or below. And again, these can be layered within the same building. So it is possible to have a handful of National Housing Trust Fund units, home investment partnership units, and state funding all layered within the same building. For the period of affordability, the requirements are 30 years. We can extend this out. So we do have some projects that, for example, have first mortgages from Fannie or Freddie, and then they have Virginia Housing first mortgages that extend to 35 or 40 years, and we can extend this to be coterminous, but the minimum requirement by each source is 30 years. So the nitty gritty, the typical type of assistance is low interest, deferred principal permanent loans. Essentially what this means is for the duration of the affordability period, interest only payments are made. Virginia Housing serves as our loan servicer. We don't do cash flow loans or construction disbursements. The funding that is made available at permanent conversion only. Typically that is secured by a second position deed of trust. High E is slightly different in that it is a 0% interest, like de facto loan that is made to the project. All of the funds can be structured as either fully forgivable or they can be balloon payment. That sort of depends on what the project underwriting requires and is flexible from DHCD's perspective. The allowable high E funding per project, there is not a per unit cap. It is $2 million or 10% of total development costs. The high E amount is awarded, Charlene, as a percentage of total development costs. So it is 10% or $2 million, whichever is lower. And these are detailed again in the program guidelines. The program guidelines are currently posted to the DHCD website. The major change that will occur is honestly on the very first page, where the spring due date has been determined as April the 4th. Outside of that, everything else is remaining the same. For National Housing Trust Fund, what percentage of assisted units need to be at 30%? So for each of our federal sources, we select a number of assisted units. So if a building has 50 units in it, we will, determining at underwriting, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 units will be federally assisted per program. This is explained in more detail in the program guidelines, but if in a 50-unit building, an application was made for National Housing Trust Fund, we would pick between 5 and 10 of those units on a floating basis to be assisted with National Housing Trust Fund. Those units are entirely at 30% AMI. The program guidelines does go into some information about layering voucher assistance on top of that, but the requirement is for the federally assisted units for National Housing Trust Fund entirely to be 30% or below. So again, program requirements remaining the same. These are all detailed in the program guidelines. What this means is that the home program requirements around entitlements or community housing development organizations is the same. The high E performance requirements have not been changed. The permanent supportive housing requirements have not been changed, so on and so forth. Again, none of the primary program structure has changed between fiscal year 2022 and this year. It is just the structure of the application as you view it in CAMS is different. So for each of the federal programs, Although all of the application is made under the same umbrella ASNH application, there are still independent pieces that have to be met in order to maintain compliance with the federal program as it's written. So for the home program, there are really three main pieces that make it different from our Housing Trust Fund dollars. Number one, home funds can be distributed directly to a smaller locality than a state. So the home program makes a direct disbursement to entitled areas or consortium areas. These localities are detailed in the program guidelines, Appendix A. If your project is in, for example, the city of Richmond, Richmond receives its own disbursement of home funds. Your project can still apply for home funding at the state level. However, we require a 25% match of local funds before we can fund that project. The match needs to be committed at time of application, and we do request that the letter of commitment is submitted with your application. So it cannot be a pending application of locally controlled dollars. That can be local funding that comes through like the CDBG program, but there are other instances of local funding, including some waived local fees that count towards that match. There is also a scoring preference for projects located in non-entitled areas. So if you are in Louisa County, for example, your project for the home scoring would get 5 additional points on its score out of 100 total points, and it would not need to have a local match. So those are the major changes between entitled or non-entitled areas. There is also a scoring preference for CHODO involvement. So if you are working for an organization that is state certified CHODO, meaning you've put through your application in CAMS, Carly has sent you the letter to say you are approved, then you do get a scoring preference on the home funds. And it also, if you are a certified CHODO at DHCD, it also opens you up to the availability of funding for some operating funding while you are developing the approved project. Appendix A with the entitlement localities is linked in the program guidelines that are in the comments already. So if you click there on that link to the program guidelines and scroll towards the back, Appendix A with the entitlement localities is listed. Within home, as you think about which application cycle you are coming into or where your project is in development, the home program requires that there is a full environmental review with a public notice period prior to any, quote, choice limiting activities occurring. And essentially what this means is that if your project is already under development, meaning you have done site work, you have gone vertical, all of those things disqualify you from home unless you have previously received HUD site approval. Again, more details in the program guidelines, and if you are a first-time applicant working with the home program, I would encourage you to reach out to us, schedule a meeting to talk through where your project is and which funding source makes the most sense, or how to layer all three of them together to make sure that your application is competitive. For community housing development organizations, this is a special carve-out type of organization under the home program only. There is a CHODO application in CAMS. Carly has worked really hard on making that a straightforward application process. We only can give a scoring preference if DHCD has certified the application for CHODO status. So if you are locally or regionally certified CHODO, we still need you to go through our application process in order to be certified. Those CHODO requirements must be met continually throughout CHODO involvement, and there is an annual recertification required in CAMS. It's pretty straightforward and simple, but if you have an ongoing home project, then every year that you are applying for or receiving funding, you have to recertify your organization. Carly is our primary point of contact. Her email is in the guidelines, and we will release that at the end of the call as well. And we can talk through what changes might be necessary moving forward for your organization to certify. All right, before we move into High E, are there any questions specific to the home program? Excellent. So the High E performance requirements, again, these are additional requirements that are made. Nasser asked about Davis-Bacon compliance. We award only 11 or fewer units and don't trigger Davis-Bacon with the structure of our program. For High E performance, this is, again, additional requirements above and beyond typical energy performance requirements. In all honesty, these are very project specific. So I am happy to talk through at a high level what's required that is different from like a LIHTC energy compliance component. But I would recommend that any project that is applying for High E for the first time, contact us, set up a call with your third-party certification company and us, and we're happy to talk through the nuances of the program. For new construction, the most straightforward, we require a green building certification. The acceptable certifications are detailed in the program guidelines. There's 4 of them. And the Zero Energy Ready Homes Department of Energy certification. There are some additional components beyond the ZERH certification that needs to come in with your application. These are detailed in the program guidelines, and they are detailed in the application instructions and in the application itself. Essentially, what we are looking for is a piece of documentation that shows the green building certification, the Zero Energy Ready Homes preliminary certification for each type of unit in the project, and an average HERS index with the associated preliminary documentation submitted with the application as well. And these HERS requirements vary based on the type of building that you are making an application for. We also allow for projects to apply for additional funding based on providing qualified permanent supportive housing units. Permanent supportive housing is not a universal term. So different agencies are looking for different items, both in terms of population served and in what that service looks like. For DHCD, what we are looking for is units that are serving those who are chronically or HUD homeless, those with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and those with serious mental illnesses. Those are the 3 target populations for the policies that DHCD is attempting to address with our application for construction funding. What that looks like, and there is, again, more detail in the program guidelines, but with our scoring process, there is a 5-point increase in scoring if a project is providing permanent supportive housing units. There is a minimum number or percentage of unit that scales depending on the size of the building. I will say that the biggest piece here is that compliance in the application process is not identical to Virginia Housing's LIHTC program with that set aside. What we are looking for is a 60-day listing on Virginia Housing Search if there's not an immediate referral at vacancy notice. And we are looking for an MOU with a referring agency. So not the master DBHDS Virginia Housing referral process necessarily, but rather the direct agency that would make the referral to place into the unit. And again, if you do have questions about what this looks like logistically within an application, please shoot us an email, give us a call, and we're happy to talk through that with you. There are some additional requirements that are cross-cutting requirements where even if your project is not coming in for federal funding, we require compliance. I would say the biggest one here is Section 504 accessibility. So this is rental new construction and substantial alterations, which is a federal term. What we are looking for here is a certification. This will ultimately, with an award and a program agreement, loan commitment, there will be an architect certification of the minimum number of units that are required to meet Section 504 accessibility standards. I would say most of our developments do not fall under the other alterations to the maximum extent feasible, but fall under the 5% of units for those with mobility impairments and 2% of total units for sensory impairments. This is scaling as to the total number of units. So again, if you have questions about this as you're filling out your application, feel free to reach out to us. We can link to the UFAS requirements. There are additional federal regulations. All of our projects must certify that they're meeting Fair Housing Act, Lead Safe Housing, uniform relocation, and so forth. Before we hop into application submission, I will scroll through these questions. Tracy asks, if a project already started construction, can it be eligible for funding? If you have a 70-15-16 site approval authority to use grant funds from HUD and have already completed a Part 58 review process, including public notice, then it is possible that we can allocate home funding to the project. We would need to have a consultation phone call ahead of time just to review the documentation. The National Housing Trust Fund process is slightly different, and the state funding does not require environmental review at all. So HUD has a few different branches of funding that all touch rental multifamily subsidized housing. And so some of those follow the required NEPA process for home funds, and some of them don't. So we would just need to touch base with the environmental reviewer, the locality that performed that, and see what their files look like and make a determination as to whether we could award home funds. Outside of home funding, the requirements are slightly different. And again, with state funding, there is no requirement for an environmental review. All right, any other questions before we move forward? So again, I just put the link to the program guidelines in the chat. This is going to be the best reference. It talks through more detail all of these pieces, and it also has a number of links to internal and external resources to help applicants determine the best path forward in terms of timing, funding requirements, and for application submission. All applications are required to be in CAMS. If you did not submit an application after August or so of last year, a UEI will be required to be updated in your CAMS organizational profile. The DUNS number is discontinued for our purposes. So the number one thing to do is to register the organization in CAMS on the DHCD website. Once you log into CAMS, you will be able to see all the available applications. Ours will pop up again this coming Friday, March the 3rd. The application instructions walk through each of the screens that you will see in the CAMS application. They give some instructions for each of the screens that you see. The application instructions are also provide like an offline or off CAMS copy of all of the narrative questions that you're expected to answer and each of the attachments and an explanation of the attachments, whether it's required or not. On April the 4th at midnight, the application will close. We have an internal DHCD panel that reviews for eligibility and completeness. So if we are missing information, again, DHCD does not currently offer an opportunity to cure. So I encourage everyone to submit in advance of April the 4th. Make sure that you're reviewing the application instructions, submitting all of the attachments that are required, answering all narrative questions. After we have determined which projects that are submitted are eligible and complete applications, we then score each application individually and come together to review scoring as a panel. We score on a scale of 0 to 100 with a minimum 60 points for funding. However, we rank applications and award funding from the highest to the lowest until money runs out. So it is possible to have an application that scores 65 or 70 points, but we don't have the funding to extend an offer to that project. Our 100-point scoring is divided into 3 primary categories. The largest category is need. What need is this fulfilling in the area or through the Commonwealth? What we're looking for is documentation that the project proposed fills a critical need within the market area. Permanent supportive housing projects receive a 5-point preference in this category. And for home funding only, projects that are located outside of the entitled or consortium localities receive points as well. And effectively what this means is that the lowest possible score for the Housing Trust Fund dollars is 5 points in this category, and the lowest possible score for home funds is 0. So all Housing Trust Fund projects receive that baseline 5 points that in home is only awarded to projects outside of entitled or consortium localities. Feasibility is the second scoring metric, and that is a total of 30 points. And what we are looking for here is readiness and ability to come to a timely completion. So within the feasibility section, we are looking to see, is this project shovel ready? Is it but for ASNH funds ready to go? Things that could potentially penalize a project in this area would be still going through your zoning processes, having a significant amount of funding outstanding. So we're really looking for projects that are ready to begin construction, as our funding, essentially as gap funding, allows for extension of additional construction funds. The last category is developer capacity, and this is really the whole development team. So whether the applicant is going to be the contractual developer of the property, or if they are the owner in partnership with other organizations, what we're looking for here is the full scope of the development team has the ability to successfully complete projects, deliver affordable housing, and also maintain ongoing compliance. So for that 30-year timeframe, is the full development team or project property management team in place to ensure compliance through the affordability period. This section is where, again, for home funds only, a project with a CHODO involved in the process receives an additional 5 points. For high E, it's a non-competitive source that is awarded tied to a competitive application. So what that means is that the project must secure an award and accept an award of Virginia Housing Trust Fund, National Housing Trust Fund, or home funds in order to be eligible for high E funding. That can take place in the same application cycle. So it is possible to apply, for instance, for $1 million of 2 competitive sources, and then also apply for high E. We rank applications, make recommendations for funding, and then after the project has been recommended for a competitive source, evaluate the high E criteria and the documentation associated with the project. You can also do this in a separate application. So if your project applied for funding maybe a year ago, 6 months ago, and received an award of competitive funds, and then in the design process, you realized that it could be beneficial to achieve high E requirements and then come in for that funding source, you can also apply for funding independent of a competitive application after the project has secured competitive funds. Are there any questions about that process? I think this is the place where most applicants can get hung up. Mario asked about post-scoring review. Yes, DHCD provides technical assistance both before and after the application. And what that means is that if projects did not receive funding and they request it, not everybody wants to talk to me after the fact. If an applicant that is unsuccessful requests to go over the scoring, we are happy to make time for that. Will asks if you have to apply for the maximum amount of another source before requesting high E funding. The answer to that is no. You have to have funding from a competitive source, but you are not required to exhaust the availability of competitive funds before coming in for high E funding. So we have one project, for example, where they have applied for $100,000 of a competitive source and then 10% of their total development costs through high E. So they're receiving more high E than they are of the competitive source. The purpose is to show that the project meets the requirements that are, or the policies that the program is trying to achieve in providing this style of housing, meaning the developer has the capacity to deliver it. We have a timely project. We're not sitting on the funding. The project is meeting a need in the immediate market area. But then once the project has scored out, there is not a requirement to take most of the competitive funding and minimize the high E funding. All right, we will wrap up the notification and contract process, and then if anyone wants to come off mute, ask a question that way, we can accommodate that. So the notification process, again, the Office of the Governor of Virginia makes the announcements. And so typically what will happen is the press secretary makes a news announcement. Our team reaches out over email within 1 to 2 business days to all applicants. So whether they are successful or unsuccessful, the project primary contact identified in CAMS will receive a notification of funding or of an unsuccessful application. We cannot answer questions on the timing or the contents of the announcements. After an announcement is made, again, we reach out to that project primary contact. I will say when you are filling out your application, please make sure that that project primary contact is listed and accurate. This is the way that we get in touch with you. So we send an email with the award letter or information on an unsuccessful application. We only send it to that project primary contact. Please make sure that that information is accurate and kept up to date. That is also one of the places that we can't make any changes. So only the organization members themselves or the organization manager in CAMS can make changes to staffing. So if you are seeing odd emails on announcements or automated emails from CAMS to folks that aren't with your organization anymore, or their job duties have changed, we ask that you log in and keep your CAMS organizational profile up to date. That is a place where we cannot make the changes. After an award is made, we provide a terms letter that details the negotiable pieces of the contract, the interest rate. We discuss the length of affordability term, whether it will be second lien position, third lien position. All of those pieces come in one sort of guideline document that walks you through any additional stipulations of the funding. We use that to create the program agreement. Typically, we allow up to 12 months from the date of notification to complete all pre-contract requirements and then execute the program agreement, which is our internal formal commitment of funding. And then those program agreements transition over to Virginia Housing to create loan commitments since they're our actual loan servicer. And then we typically allow about 24 months for completion of the project and conversion after that. All right, any additional questions? Feel free, we have a smaller group today. So if you would like to come off mute and ask your question that way instead of in the chat, if there's any additional information, we are happy to talk through that. We have a little bit more time booked with you. I can put, my email is in the program guidelines, but I can put it here in the chat as well. If you have questions, feel free to send them to me. They will, honestly, likely get forwarded to another member of the team, but we can get questions answered within a couple of days as well. Again, when we are transitioning at the end of this week, early next week from Google to Microsoft, we will not, for the entirety of business hours, necessarily have full access to emails on phones. We're anticipating it to be a pretty smooth switchover. I will be the first to admit that I have already printed out the guidelines for what we need to do for day one. They're sitting on my desk because I am not certain that I can execute the technical aspects of that switchover. So we will do our best to answer within a day or so once that switchover takes place. Any other questions? We'll hang on the line about 5 more minutes to field any questions.
Hi, Chloe. This is Chris Early. I do have a question.
Go for it, Chris.
So I'm constantly trying to learn and bone up on high E, and I just want to make sure I understood what you said as it relates to a competitive application of other sources vis-a-vis the high E funds. You made a comment about the a previous competitive application having some relationship to the submission of a high E request. Can you repeat that or clarify that for me? I just want to make sure I understood what you stated.
Absolutely. This is the place that I I apologize. They are constructing a new office directly adjacent to my office. And so if you are hearing sounds, they're not controllable by me.
No problem.
So this is the place I think that, in all honesty, I have not landed on succinct language that I think consistently gets the point across. And that is that for high E funds, there has to be a competitive award. That can happen concurrently. So you could put in an application this spring for funding from Virginia Housing Trust Fund, for example, and then also apply in that same round for the same project in the same application. It's all hosted together in CAMS for high E funding. You can also have, for example, applied in spring of last year, 2022, and requested Virginia Housing Trust Fund. Even if you did not request high E at that time, if you, upon review of your project, its design, the requirements for high E, you realize that you would like to come in for high E funding, you could do that this spring. So once you have secured a competitive award of funding, if you want to come in for high E, which technically speaking is not competitive funding, you don't have to apply for more competitive funds. So if you have a Virginia Housing Trust Fund award from spring 22, you don't need to then apply for additional competitive funds to put in application for high E in spring 23 for that same project. Does that answer your question, Chris?
That was clear and eloquent, and I appreciate you repeating it so I understand it now. Thank you.
Sure. It is different from our other funding sources, and it is not something that I think necessarily makes a lot of sense when we all operate in the world of competitive cycles all of the time.
Sure. Thank you for clarification.
Sure. Jen, I did see your question. What I can say about previous funding round announcements is that all the applications are under review and the announcement comes directly from the office of the governor, and my team is prepared to be in contact with all applicants, successful or not, within 1 to 2 business days after that application announcement or the funding announcement is made. All right, anything else? Again, we will post this recording as well as updated home ownership recordings if your organization applies for both of those sources. The program guidelines will be updated with a few changes to the first couple of pages, but no significant changes to the bulk of the program requirements. That will take place the early part of next week after the homeownership recording is completed on Thursday. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out to myself or to Carly. We're happy to set up a meeting. Yes, my phone number and my email are in the guidelines. In all honesty, if you can email myself or Carly to set up a meeting, that is the easiest way to get a hold of me because I can do that before or after business hours. Where phone calls, I have to be like free in real time. It also allows us to get a little bit extra information about your project. So I would recommend reviewing the program guidelines and sort of giving us a high-level overview of your project when you make a request for a meeting. General information like we are in pre-development or we expect to break ground in June, sort of like a general idea of where you are in the time frame, the locality, because that helps guide our information that we give to you, and the number of units. All right, if there are no further questions, we will stop the recording in about 2 minutes and leave you to your lunchtime.